trying to get him a gold label. Bill Shorten very much on his negative message, really, about that he is the only one to save Medicare. Without further ado, I'd like to bring in one half of my political panel. Unfortunately, Michael Kroger could not stay, but I'm pleased that former Labor Rudd strategist Bruce Hawker is with us and could wait through that press conference. Thanks very much, Bruce, for putting up with our... Of course, we go live to everything.
More than happy.
Well, I want to ask you firstly, obviously, about this. I mean, Labor is so not backing away from this attack on the government over Medicare. In fact, Bill Shorten, as you heard there, is intensifying the attack, despite the government's protestations that there were no plans, there is no plan. Is this a good political strategy for Bill Shorten because he's continuing it? Well, would you be advising him to pull back or stay with it?
I think he's on to something that's going to really ignite people's concerns in the last couple of weeks of the campaign. It's one thing to start a scare campaign where there's no evidence to back it up, but as you just saw in that extensive, lengthy press conference, there's plenty of smoke there. And that's where I think the government's in trouble. They established this this task force within the Department of Health at a cost of $5 million, employed 20 people to do it, and said nothing about it for 18 months. As soon as you start hearing that sort of information, I can tell you from a campaigner's perspective, that's the sort of thing that people start to get worried about. If you come up with something which is completely out of left field and has no substance or basis to it at all, then I think it's much harder. But with this one, I think we're going to see it run right through to election day. And if it were not for the fact that Tony Abbott had come out on the eve of the election in 2013 and said there'd be no cuts to health, none to education, none to pensions and none to the ABC, then there might be some credibility in the denials by Prime Minister Turnbull that they're not going to go down this path. But the fact that there's precedent for them saying one thing in an election campaign and then going and doing the exact opposite when they form government is more proof that Labor's onto something strong here.
Well, it was interesting because in Q&A last night, part of Mr Turnbull's answer, he did sort of admit to, yes, we made big cuts to health in the 2014 budget after that promised pre-election. Then he seemed to correct himself and called them changes. Yeah. So that could have been, you know, a slip of the tongue. But is it, I mean, the government says it's a lie, but in fact they were forced to dump whatever even proceedings they had started on this at the weekend. They, you know, whether it was going to be outsourced or privatised the payment system. Now, that is part of Medicare. Because this is the other issue. The government says it's just the back office. Who cares about who services your EFTPOS if you go into a store? You don't care who does that. You still shop at the store. Does this really make any difference to Medicare? Who might be running the back office payment system?
Well, as we know with these things, you know, they start with the small, easy-to-do exercises and then they see if they can get away with that, and then they move on to the tougher things. That's a proved and well-trodden path I've seen with privatisations at state and federal level. So I don't think people would get any comfort from the fact that they're going down this path. And by the way, if they are going down a commercial path with this sort of thing, that means that somebody's got to make a profit out of it. That means that somewhere down along the line, that's going to have an impact on Medicare payments. And we've already seen, as Shorten said constantly there, a government that's prepared to freeze Medicare payments has got no real commitment to it in the way in which Labor has.
But do you think this is going to be a difficult area for the government? I mean, you might have heard Scott Morrison earlier this morning saying there's absolutely nothing to see here. There was no plan. You know, it didn't proceed. It didn't get to Cabinet, and yet Cabinet was used, Cabinet protection was used on the FOI claim.
Exactly. And so more evidence, again, of something happening there, which was not revealed to the public. I mean, the tender process that they went through in order to go through this privatisation exercise was not made public at the time. That's another fact that has, you know, that makes people concerned when they hear all the facts that, well, why were they being so secretive about it? Why didn't they come out and say a tender's been let and this is what the purpose of it is?
Well, there was a line in the 2014 budget that said that, you know, this money would be allocated and that they would be able to, you know, seek...
It was done in... the terminology was very...
providers.
Yeah, it was very, very vague statement about what they were intending to do. And of course, in 2014, a heck of a lot of other things were happening as well down that line, which they've tried to walk away from with, basically hiding from the budget that the Abbott government tried to introduce.
Just a few more issues on this question. What do you think about Labor had also looked at possible other ways to deal with the payment system back in 2009? Now, I know we're going a long way back, but this is part of the government's argument that Labor is being hypocritical about this.
The proof of the pudding is really in the eating. You know, Labor's always been a strong supporter of Medicare. Medibank was established by the Whitlam government, Medicare, and of course it was abolished effectively by the Fraser government. It was reintroduced by the Hawke government, and throughout its long history, Labor has been one for advancing Medicare, not cutting it. I think the proof of the pudding's in the eating on that one. All
right, just on negative campaigning, the government and Scott Morrison started again on this today about criticising attacking Labor's negative gearing changes. Now, we haven't heard as much of an attack in the last few weeks of the campaign as we did early in the campaign about negative gearing changes, but he was very strong on that today. Now, is this a potential strong point for the government to, you know, he said any policy that undermines house values undermines the economy. If they continue to attack Labor's changes to negative gearing, is that a potential plus in that sense for the government?
Well, it's interesting that they started off with it and they walked away from it, you know, in the campaign proper. Maybe they were leaving it for the last part of the campaign. But generally, what happens is that you get your pollsters out there testing the arguments, and if they really start to resonate with the electorate, then you see them being ramped up. Maybe they're just leaving this for the last part of the election campaign, or maybe, as I suspect is the case, most people don't have a negatively geared property, don't really feel threatened by it, unlike the fake tradie guy who's on the TV at the moment, and therefore it doesn't really necessarily resonate much with them. But we'll have to wait and see how that plays over the next couple of weeks.
But I mean, Scott Morrison made a viable and a valuable point that a lot of people's wealth, once they do get into the property market, particularly in expensive cities like Sydney and Melbourne, once you do get into the house market, a lot of your wealth is tied up in your house. So that scare about could it deflate the value of homes is a potent weapon.
Well, we'll just have to wait and see how that plays out. But I think, you know, you have to look at the detail of Labor's commitment on negative gearing there, and they're grandfathering all the existing properties, all the existing arrangements. It's only future ones. And there's any number of economists who'll come out and tell you that this is not going to adversely affect the price of housing.
All right, just one final big picture, if you can. Seats sort of count, but particularly I want to ask you about these potential kingmakers, perhaps in the House, but certainly in the Senate.
Well, I think the big sleeper in all this is the Xenophon Party. We're hearing that they could pick up as many as 4 seats in South Australia. If they do that, then they'll effectively replace Palmer as being the party that calls the shots in the Senate.
Along with the Greens?
And of course, along with the Greens, who will continue to do well in this election because it's a double dissolution election. Everyone told Turnbull that you don't go down the path of a double dissolution if you want to reduce the influence of the minor parties, because when you have a double dissolution, you're halving the quota. So they'll do quite well in this election as well. There's one thing I'm absolutely certain about: no one is going to come out of this election campaign controlling the Senate. It's going to be a muddle.
None of the big parties. All right, and briefly in the House, do you think Labor, from your point of view, your side of politics, can possibly do it, can win 19 seats in its own right?
Well, you never say never. I think it's always going to be a tough ask because 19 seats is a huge number. I think a more likely scenario would be a hung parliament in the lower house as well. But, you know, if this whole issue around Medicare and other issues start to really affect the public's thinking, and that's the swinging voters' thinking in the last 10 days of the election campaign, then who knows what sort of a result we're going to see on election day.
So a hung parliament is still a possibility, you reckon?
Oh, yes. I mean, they really only need to lose 13 seats in order to have a hung parliament after the redistribution went before the election. If Labor had had just had a mediocre result and picked up, say, 10 seats, then, wow, you only need 3 more seats to go, and you've got people like Windsor in New England, you've got Greens who are knocking on both Liberal and Labor doors in Victoria. You've got Xenophon candidates in South Australia. If any of them come second, they will win the seat that they're contesting in South Australia. I think it's a very interesting time we're going into.
All right, Bruce Hawker, thank you so much for joining me. Sorry, we only